conscience for the Christian is, as the Vatican Council says, our most secret core. It is the place in our heart and soul where we come to an understanding that our obligations as human beings, that our obligation as human being is to do good and avoid evil. It's really the centerpiece of the moral life, because it is the place where the person understands the call of God to do good, to live his or her life within the framework of the moral good. Now, that sounds like a very abstract idea, but it's a calling. It's a calling to do good and to avoid evil. And it is, as I said, the centerpiece of our moral life. As we develop as human beings, we come to realize that this idea of do good and avoid evil is very abstract, and we don't encounter the call to do good and avoid evil within in the abstract. We encounter it in the very concrete details of human life. So for Christians, I think the conscience is where we begin to discern how in each circumstance we can live the truth, we can live God's calling to us. And especially the conscience is where we deliberate and discern the moral good in relation to the moral life, the ethical life. And of course our lives are full of demands and dilemmas that we encounter every day in terms of, whether we how we treat our neighbour, how we engage with our family, to what extent we participate in public life, how we do our politics, how we are in church. All of these have ethical dimensions, and the conscience really is the place where we deliberate and discern what is the right thing to do. In terms of how the conscience is formed, I think it's very important to say that that synopsis I gave there may sound very individualistic, but of course for Christians, our moral lives are not individualistic. They're not framed in a narrow way. We are Christians in community. We learn and discern our moral values in the community that is the church. And so in terms of how the moral conscience is formed, it is formed first and foremost through the shaping of our moral characters and through education in the moral virtues. How does this happen? It happens through our families, through our church, through our immersion in ritual and liturgy, through our reading of our sacred texts, the Bible, through our engagement and understanding of our moral tradition, especially the teaching of the magisterium. And what I like to remember always is that there are many sources of the formation of the moral conscience. And in contemporary society, we tend to, I think, truncate the formation of conscience and assume that the conscience is formed primarily and almost exclusively sometimes by the magisterium. I think that is an inappropriate narrowing of the tradition of Catholicism, which has always had a very full and dynamic view of the way in which conscience is formed. So as I said, there are many sources of the formation of conscience: the individual's own discernment and reflection, and spiritual life. That's very important. The encounters and the relationships the person has with those around them, the way in which the person lives in their religious community, and then also the formal teaching authority of the Church. So those, I think, are the linchpins of the formation of conscience. They're very diverse. They teach us different things. So as we read the Bible and the New Testament, that is something that shapes our character, rather than giving us concrete guidance often on what to do on a very specific moral issue. The teaching authority of the Church through the magisterium helps us by giving us guidance on particular moral issues, as well as shaping our character. So we have, just to summarize, many resources within the Christian tradition that helps us form our conscience. I think we do well to remember that we shouldn't narrow those sources, and we shouldn't prioritize one above the other. There are many sources. They work in cooperation with each other, and together they help us as individuals shape our moral character. How do we understand our obligations to our conscience? What is the authority of conscience, really? This is something that has been debated very recently. When I say very recently, I mean in the last 30 years, I guess, in Catholic moral theology. How central is the authority of conscience? And in a way, going back to people like Newman and also to Benedict, Pope Benedict himself, when he was writing as Cardinal Ratzinger, we say our obligations to conscience are all. We must follow our conscience. And in a way that makes very good sense. If in my deepest heart I absolutely believe that this is the right course of action, of course I'm obligated to follow it. To say anything else just really makes no sense. The question then, of course, is, but what happens if my conscience is telling me to do something that is fundamentally wrong, or that is problematic, or that is in conflict with something that is taught? And here I think we get into some very difficult territory. I would say ultimately for each individual the person is obliged to follow his or her conscience, but that's in a way the beginning of the obligation rather than the end of it, because then the person is really obliged also to ensure that he or she is not involved in some kind of self-deception, in just ignorant of the issues, the totality of the situation, etc. So there's a very strong obligation on the individual to educate his or her conscience, to ensure that it is open to all points of view. And I think I would especially say that when one finds that if I find that my conscience is telling me to do something that is contrary to accepted norms, I mean, that can be very important. A lot of our prophetic people have really acted with their conscience against the prevailing norms of the society, and that has helped us to make very important transitions and leaps forward. One thinks of slavery, one thinks of the terrible destruction in war and the failure in the 19th century to protect civilians at all. All of these issues, all of the progress we've made has been made very often by people whose conscience tells them to act against the prevailing norms. So we must, give space for that and acknowledge that that happens sometimes. But in addition, I think, within the Catholic tradition, when we find that our points of view are running contrary to church teaching, for example, I think there is a strong obligation on us to try and understand why that is the case, precisely what is going on. Why am I departing from church teaching on a particular matter? Why does my conscience tell me that I ought to act some way differently? And I think it's very easy to be involved in self-deception, to think that one has actually taken account of all points of view but has just dismissed things for various reasons. So there is, I think, a very strong obligation on us to follow our own conscience, but to ensure that that conscience is informed by a variety of sources, and also especially to take full and serious account of what the church teaches on a certain matter. But I think it is also important to say that what the church teaches ultimately on following one's conscience is that conscience must be obeyed.
The obligation of conscience, I suppose, is to keep checking ourselves so that we're sure that we're not making a decision primarily on the basis of self-interest. We try to be as objective as possible and correct our tendency to bias our decision by seeking what seems to be, in the short term, in our own interest or in the interest of those who are closest to us, without looking objectively at the whole setting. And in fact, it was the function of traditional moral norms to keep, calling our attention to those objective parameters. That was their legitimate function.
I think the first way a person should use the word conscience is not something that gives me license to do anything. Sometimes you hear a person saying, well, I have to follow my conscience. And you'd like them to actually be willing to follow their conscience. As a matter of fact, they're saying this because they just want to do whatever they want to do. But, in the whole Christian tradition on conscience has always been requiring things from us. It's always been beckoning things from us. It's always been calling for things for us. If a person really follows their conscience, it's really the voice of God beckoning them to become God's disciple. So, to say that we want to raise up conscience, as we do, and we have to, is not to be saying people can do whatever they want to do because their conscience lets them. No, their conscience really calls them to become someone, to be in the image of God that they are created. So the first thing is a willingness to surrender myself to my conscience. But the second thing is that after you've done that, and of course you do that all life long, you have to keep asking yourself, am I really following my conscience? Am I really letting myself be open to God's will? Am I really letting God's voice speak to me? After, opening yourself up to your conscience, second, though, is to look for right formation of your conscience. And right formation of your conscience is an enormous task. I've used as a metaphor parenting. And I look at parents and how they're always trying to form the conscience of their children on any number of things. Probably the most important thing that a parent does in forming the conscience of their children is helping their children to get along with one another. And as any parent knows, you leave children in a room together, they'll be fighting with one another at some point. And a parent needs to come in and to teach them some skills, to see that it's better to share, to get along with one another, to appreciate one another's presence, to really support that. So the parent is really helping the child form her or his conscience so that they can get along with one another better. That's an enormous amount of work that a parent does.
There's a way in which Catholic sense of conscience has a real community reference that it's hard for my students to get this. I think it's hard for most Americans to get this, that yes, in the sanctity of your conscience you make your decision, but you're a fool if you're not listening to wise people, including people of other cultures, including the past. Scripture is foundational. It tells us who we are. So Scripture is the basic statement of the identity of Christians, of the identity of the church. It talks about, it is the vehicle of God's revelation. Scripture does not provide us with a lot of answers to the questions that we have about morality. That's not its intent. It's not that sort of God dropped the book on the world and took off. In fact, Scripture is always meant to be part of a church which is constantly discerning, constantly trying to figure out how God is calling us. So that discernment is going to integrate Scripture, tradition, which includes the magisterium, reason, and experience. But Scripture is foundational in the sense that it's the charter document of the community. It's the basic statement of who we are as Christians and who we are called to be.